Hey, I'm Ralph, and this is my review of Cyberpunk 2077. I got a lot of requests to check this game out. It's pretty flashy, and I really like the ideas in it. I could almost imagine watching the game, like as a movie or a show. I like shows. There used to be this show on when I was a kid. I thought it was a show. I was so little, sometimes I think I just dreamed the whole thing up. You know how that is? Memories you used to have. Sometimes it turns out that never happened to me. I thought it did. Other times somebody tells you about something that happened when you were a little kid and you're like, how'd I ever forget that? This show, I remember, there was only ever one season with 13 episodes. I feel like I must have seen them all a dozen times on the local cable channel, but that was back in the mid-80s, and I've never seen it aired again since. I can't find anything about it online. It was a kid's show, an adventure show about a young boy who was looking for some sort of a sacred icon, something ancient, but scientific too, almost futuristic. He was making his way through a big jungle in South America or Africa. It was hard to tell. One time they suggested it was in Antarctica, but some sort of like weird warm part of it. There was the main kid, Billy, and his best friend, a Chinese girl named Andy, and there was Salvador, a talking blue python who lived in Billy's backpack, and Professor Evan Skeleton, who was an expert on whatever the show needed him to know about, from geology and physics to solipsistic philosophy and ancient burial rites. It was a pretty wholesome show, at least at first. Every episode they'd have an adventure and meet up with natives or a lost scientist. One time, they met Amelia Earhart. At the end of every episode, Billy or one of his companions would learn a lesson like, be kind to others, or don't leave an unattended fire. But as the show went on, things got stranger. The plot lines grew less coherent and more esoteric, almost instinctual, like the characters were being motivated by their subconscious desires. As the narrative grew darker and more dense, the jungle they were in did the same. The forest itself became thicker, with less obvious paths, and more time was spent in each episode just carving their way through the foliage. They stopped seeing so many animals, and there were less birds on the audio track. The characters spent more and more time being frustrated, angry, or just confused. They wouldn't really argue, but you could tell they were all getting sick of each other. And there were some subtle implications that the professor was thinking about taking his own life. Possibly out of guilt for a child he abandoned who might have been one of the writers of the show itself. Like I said, it got hard to follow. Another episode involved Billy eating a fruit that turned his hands bright red and compelled him to write a sort of manifesto or a Bible. At the end of that episode, when Billy was done writing and his hands had gone back to normal, the words he'd written rose up off the page and formed a doorway through which Billy could see his old home where he used to live. He almost went back, but I guess he knew that if he did, he'd be leaving his friends to die. So instead, he stayed with them. There was a boy with tiger eyes named Jeff, who carried a map of a forgotten city written on a great scroll, which was the skin of a monstrously large, ancient worm. Maybe that's worm spelled W-Y-R-M, not W-O-R-M. I never really learned the difference, but I know they're not the same. Jeff was on his own mission, which seemed to run parallel to Billy's, but was clearly a much more somber, thoughtful adventure. In one episode, there was a whole story within a story about a god named Ravor, who wanted to die, but he couldn't kill himself because of a theory that the suicide of a god would doom the entire universe. So Ravor spent thousands of years cultivating different religious wars in this one region of the earth, until he'd finally created a small religious order with the singular purpose of finding and killing Ravor himself. The cultists, they thought they were defeating some horrible malicious evil, when in fact they were just caught up in the machinations of a very sad old being that just didn't want to be alive anymore. Ravor's last act was to say, "Thank you," as the cultist slid her iron blade into Ravor's glowing heart. And then the knife caught fire and the cultist's body began to burn, losing half her arm before she could get away. It was that same cultist who told the story to Billy and Andy shortly before the old woman's body turned to dust. About halfway through the season, a narrative device was introduced involving a cult who were giving the characters reoccurring dreams of another world. It was a lot of nightmare imagery, some of which I can still remember pretty clearly to this day. Giant eyeballs on stalks growing out of the ground like trees, but painfully. Like it hurt for their roots to expand into the soil. There was some sort of devil woman with no face who was always hungry. A pale dog who never stopped running, which I think was meant to represent death. There was the kid, Billy, and his best friend, Andy, Salvador the Snake, and Professor Evan Skeleton. By the end of the season, Andy wound up going blind, and Salvador got lost down a hole in a cave. And the professor had basically done that thing where you lobotomize yourself to try to let the bad thoughts out. And Billy never found the icon he'd been looking for. As the last episode ended, he implied that he'd begun to suspect it didn't even really exist. Kind of a sad show is how I remember it. Not at first. At first it was a lot of fun. But gradually it developed this heaviness. Like the show itself was struggling and growing weaker as it tried to tell its story. My mom hated the cartoon. Said it was hippie propaganda and racist too. But she'd always let me watch it. I think I threw a fit once when she tried to stop me. I can't find anybody who's ever seen this show. I don't even know what it was called. Cyberpunk 2077 was too difficult for me and seemed to be kind of broken. The characters were interesting and the world seemed really compelling, but I couldn't figure out how to explore it. A bit too much like real life, honestly. 3 out of 10. I'm Ralph, and these are my game reviews.